Well, this, Bev, was what Israel says is a targeted and precise attack that they engaged to try to kill one of their most wanted men, one of the most senior Hamas commanders in Gaza, the number 2 in Gaza. His name is Mohammed Deif. Israel says it believed it had intelligence that Mohammed Deif was hiding out in what they've called a Hamas compound around the Al-Mawasi area, and that they approved personal approval from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to carry out a strike on that area to try to assassinate Mohammed Deif, who, as I just mentioned, has been on Israel's most wanted list for nearly 3 decades now. They have been hunting him for many months throughout this war. In fact, they have tried to assassinate him 7 times previously in previous decades unsuccessfully. So this would be the 8th attempt at an assassination on Mohammed Deif. It is not clear whether or not Mohammed Deif was killed. We were told in a military briefing on Saturday when the attack happened that we would be getting an update from the Israeli military on the outcomes of this strike. We haven't received that since, and the reason is because the Israeli military simply doesn't know whether or not it has killed Mohammed Deif. They had thought in previous assassination attempts that they had killed him, but that hasn't been successful. So at the moment, they are not saying whether or not they believe that he is still alive or dead, but as a result of that bombardment in that area where Palestinians who had been trying to flee war had been told to escape to the Al-Mawasi Khan Yunis area that was designated by Israel as a safe zone. In these bombings, the health ministry in Gaza says more than 90 people were killed. They say the majority of them were civilians, including a number of children, and more than 300 people were injured. It overwhelmed the hospitals around that area. The Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis had horrific reports of children being brought in with legs or limbs torn off by the force of this bombardment. Hamas says it doesn't believe that Israel was targeting Mohammed Deif. It hasn't provided any update on the condition of Mohammed Deif, whether or not he was in that area or if he is alive or dead. Hamas has labelled this a massacre. Israel hasn't commented specifically on those numbers of civilians and whether or not it did enough to avoid civilian casualties, apart from saying that it wasn't targeting civilians, that it was targeting what it calls a Hamas compound within that area. But certainly reverberations still being felt from what people in Gaza say was one of the deadliest attacks seen there in recent weeks.
Yeah, and it really highlights, Allyson, the vulnerability of, everyday Palestinians. And we know, of course, how Hamas operates and uses its own citizens. But it is that situation where many of them just feel they've got nowhere to go. They've got nowhere to hide.
This is what the IDF is saying, that Hamas hides itself within these civilian populations, in its words, using the civilian population as human shields in the hope that the IDF won't strike those areas. We know that's not the case, though, and the IDF does have responsibilities under international law to limit the numbers of civilian casualties, even if it is trying to target Hamas militants, Hamas commanders within those civilian areas. And I think it goes to exactly what you said, Bev, the fact that there are so many millions of Palestinians within Gaza who are just trying to have somewhere to live, who have been forced to flee from one place to another, to another, to another. These people in Al-Mawasi have, some of them, fled 10 times. Most of them were in Rafah before Rafah was invaded by the Israeli military, and then they moved to Al-Mawasi being told that this was the safe zone. And they have said, well, how can this be safe? How can you designate designate this area as a safe zone if you're then willing to go and attack it with giant bombs and airstrikes from the sky? And so this is a message that we've been hearing not just from people on the ground, but also human rights groups and international aid groups for the last 9 months of this fighting, that they feel that there is literally no place safe within Israel, and there's no place that if Hamas is hiding that Israel won't strike to try to find those Hamas militants. So this has put a massive sense of unease around people in that area, people who are now trying to decide whether or not they should move to another area, with the knowledge that that area may also not be safe if Israel gets intelligence that it believes Hamas militants are operating in that area as well. But a massive sense of shock and continuing unease for Palestinians in Gaza.
Yeah, and Allyson, you know, Hamas has said now it won't derail the ceasefire talks. There's grave concern that they can try and progress, though. Do we know if those talks are moving at all?
Well, after this assassination attempt on Mohammed Deif, that was the concern, that Hamas would be so enraged and incensed by it that it would not continue with the negotiations towards a ceasefire and hostage release deal. And while Hamas did initially put out a statement saying that they would not be going forward with these negotiations, that actually doesn't appear to be the case. It does appear that the negotiations are continuing this week. We know that the head of the Mossad in Israel is travelling abroad to continue negotiations with mediators from Qatar and Egypt, and also from representatives from the United States to try and reach some sort of deal. It does feel like the rhetoric is gently moving closer towards some positivity around the likelihood of a ceasefire and hostage release deal, but there are still those huge, significant gaps that need to be bridged. These demands between Israel and Hamas that have been so problematic for all of the negotiations throughout this war, that continue to be the issue. Demands around who will control Gaza if Israel pulls out. Will Israel withdraw all of its troops from Gaza, which is what Hamas wants? At the moment, Israel says it won't do that because it feels that it would leave a political vacuum there with no group to take over. But for Hamas to be able to rebuild both its military and governing capabilities there, Hamas also wants an entire end to the war. It doesn't just want a temporary ceasefire, it wants the war to end completely, which Israel has said it won't be willing to commit to until it feels that all of its goals have been met. So there are still these massive gaps between what Israel and Hamas wants, and although these negotiations are continuing, and it certainly feels like things are moving closer, we've seen in the past just how quickly any incident can derail the negotiations. But we are now in the 9th month of fighting. The situation for civilians in Gaza continues to be catastrophic, from areas ranging from the displacement through to lack of clean water and access to humanitarian and medical assistance, and the sheer psychological trauma of having to go through bombardments in the Palestinian enclave every single day for the last couple of months. It is just such a catastrophic situation there.
It's going to leave a very lasting legacy. Allyson, always good to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bev.